Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out getitInwriting.net/shows for a full list of our podcast YouTube series.
My guest is Mr. Robert Margouleff, producer, engineer, innovator, overachiever. I guess you are best known for your work with Stevie Wonder, as well as, I've got a list here. Stevie Wonder, of course, Devo, of course, Oingo Boingo, Guar, Isley Brothers, Depeche Mode, David Sanborn. You also directed movies.
Yes.
Including the lovely Chow Manhattan with Edie Sedgwick. Which...
Only part of it, though. Only the black and white footage.
Ah, okay. Well, we're going to get into that in a minute. But you've been pretty much busy your entire adult life, for the most part. Yeah. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Mikasa Multimedia. But aside from the fact that you're best known for your work with Stevie, let's rewind a little bit before that even. What's your musical background?
Well, actually, strangely enough, my musical background started off rather early. And basically, I was really exposed to more classical music than I was to pop records or as my childhood, as I'm 83 now. Back in the 40s, I can remember, Kate Smith and Bing Crosby and people like that. But I never really got really interested in pop music, with the exception of gospel, because I had a nanny, a black nanny, when I was a boy, and she used to take me occasionally to her Sunday church meetings, and I developed an affinity for that. But my basic background was in classical music. My older sister is still, she's 91 now, has a master's in keyboard from Juilliard, and we had a beautiful Steinway piano in our sunroom in our house, and she practiced night and day, Bach, Brahms, and Beethoven. So I sort of got my teething on classical music, symphonic music, and especially piano music of the Romantic times, and especially Bach too is still to this day my favorite. And so there were a lot of people in my family that were musically inclined, and I guess what do they call it? There's a name for it, but you kind of inherited. Oh, your father did that?
Yeah, okay.
It's called epigenetics.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And sort of music ran in my family, but most of the time it was classical music, and I really developed a real love for it. I really never regarded that I would ever be moving into pop or R&B as a record producer as a boy. But
did you have any training in classical music?
Yes, I did. I had a piano teacher, and then I took up the cello in 6th grade, and I was the first cellist in the Kensington School Orchestra.
Wow.
So, and my sister would play the piano, and I'd play the cello, and we had a good old time. She said my ears used to turn really red. But I felt music in my life. It was there all the time. But I sort of developed even a stronger interest when I went away to prep school. I went to a small school up in the Berkshire Mountains called the Stockbridge School.
Uh-huh.
And Stockbridge happened to be just down the road from Tanglewood. And Tanglewood was the summer home of the Boston Symphony. And they had a music school, but you didn't really get grades. You went there to perform in ensembles and solos and have master classes with members of the Boston Symphony.
Uh-huh.
And I spent a very long summer studying there, and it really woke up my my very rudimentary skills. Most of the kids who were in the music school there were already at Boston University or at Juilliard or at Manhattan School of Music, and were very much more accomplished than I. But I ended up happily, I had a good voice, I ended up happily in the choral department that summer and sang tons and tons of music, because the choir, which was a smaller group versus the chorus, but the choir, we used to have to perform for all the conducting students. So we used to read through tons of music, and my reading got really good. My voice got really supple, and we also performed with the Boston Symphony when they needed a choir for like the Fauré Requiem or the Beethoven Ninth Symphony.
The other thing about that I think is interesting is that you, because of this classical background and the fact that you were doing choral and cello, you got an overview right away of arrangement, ensemble playing, and the understanding of how all the parts work together.
Right. I really understood it. And that last summer, Tanglewood led me to really making friends with a guy named Dr. Hugh Ross, who was the head of the choral department, and also was the founder and the leader of a group called the Schola Cantorum, which was the choir for the New York Philharmonic. So that summer I sang under the baton of Charles Munch, Leonard Bernstein, Aaron Copland, a lot of the really great conductors, and I could sit in the shed in an afternoon and watch them rehearse the Boston Symphony and really begin to understand really the nuances of conducting and of ensemble playing. I ended up, to make a long story short, I ended up in the Schola, which was the choir of the New York Philharmonic. And I ended up at Manhattan School of Music, which I attended for 2 years. And I studied voice.
It's a very reputable school back then.
Yeah, and we used to go to the score desks at the old Metropolitan Opera, which was the highest rung of the balconies. You could look down, you could see every opera, you could see the people from the tops of their heads, you know. But and everybody's up there conducting, and we had score desks up there, and I really learned. And I took voice classes. I had a wonderful mezzo soprano as a voice coach, and I really did it for two years. But at the end of that time, although I felt the music and I understood it, I realized that I was not another Enrico Caruso, and that basically I could shatter a styrofoam, sort of Memorex, a styrofoam cup at 10 paces. That I had the desire and the talent, but I didn't really have the instrument. So I decided to leave that behind. And I went on to perform with the Schola for the next couple of years, you know, because it was not a full-time job, but it was my first musician's union card. So that led me along, and I ended up in the Army after that. It was just before Vietnam or during Vietnam. And I was had a choice to get drafted and go to Vietnam, or enlist and get a choice of school training. And I became a combat photographer, which is what I loved.
Oh, cool.
And you can see here in my house the output of my photography adventures. So that went a long way. But when I came back out of the Army, I settled in the East Village around the corner from the Fillmore East.
This would have been, what, like mid-60s?
Late 60s. Yeah, late 60s.
Yeah, that was, there was a little bit going on there back then, huh?
Yeah, well, the Fillmore was just opening around the corner. I went and saw I made friends with Kip Cohen, who was one of the sort of chief cook and bottle washers for the fearless leader there. And I saw the opening concert was Jefferson Airplane. And it was a wonderful time. It was, you know, all in the space. I lived in a walk up around on East 5th Street between 2nd and 3rd, which was right around the corner from the Fillmore. And I watched it change from a Yiddish theater into the Fillmore East. I realized that I was going to came out of the Army with all this training in motion pictures and combat photography, motion picture photography, basically. And I ended up sort of going into the film business, basically, is what I wanted to do. And that led very rapidly to meeting a whole bunch of people from the factory, and Andy Warhol and Edie Sedgwick and Paul America and Viva and that whole crowd, and I decided that this would be the ideal way to make a feature film. I could do the first above ground, underground movie with professional equipment instead of the stuff that Andy was using. And I got into it for a couple of years really deeply. And the film, I think, speaks for itself. It's become a sort of a cult classic. But I really still, underneath it all, was still rumbling this feeling of having to make music. And I discovered a young kid who was sitting on a pile of trash cans on East 5th Street, you know, with the chains on the lids, right? Yeah. And he's sitting there playing a 5-string guitar. His name was Timmy Harris, and he couldn't afford the 6-string. And but his music was very poppy and very good. And I said, you know, I think I can make a record with this guy. And I did. We did it for Buddha Records. By this time, I had a little studio uptown. I was shooting commercials and documentaries with a partner.
So wait, hang on, because you skipped a step here. You were doing film, and then all of a sudden you got back into music. So
yeah, a little bit at the same time.
Okay, you were already getting back into doing some music.
I was already doing it.
Okay.
But somehow it was during the Chow days that I discovered the Moog synthesizer. One of the first ones, there were some modules of it sitting under a DJ desk in a club in New York called Cerebrum. And when I heard the synthesizer for the first time in that club, it was just bleeping and blooping. But I heard that and I said, you know, since I've given all these guys from the factory and everywhere else all this professional equipment so we could work on our own without the auspices of the gatekeepers at the major film companies, we couldn't join the union. I mean, you try to join the union, they say, do you have any employment at major studios? No. Well, then you have to be employed before we can give you a union card.
Right.
You go to the film company and try to get a job. They say, we can't employ you unless you have a union card. It was sort of a catch-22. So we were really faced with doing stuff on our own. And I heard the synthesizer, and I said, this is the way to make music for Chow Manhattan. And it wasn't a week or two later after I heard it, and it was doing nonlinear, just noise, basically, for a dance club. And I heard it, and I said, you know, I really love this. I have to have one of these. And the thing is that it was at that point I realized that I'd finally found my voice as a musician, because I certainly wasn't going to be a singer or a keyboard player.
So you saw the musical potential for this, even though whoever was playing it before you was just making sounds out of it.
We can do this. This is something we can do at our little studio. It's called Centaur. I already had it set up for 35 mag playback, basically, because I was shooting commercials in that space. I had a little shooting stage.
So it was more of a film studio with musical capabilities.
Yes.
I'm trying to track sort of your gradual transition back to music, you know.
So after shooting a lot of the black and white stuff, the whole thing got very druggy and very out of control.
Wait, in the East Village in the late 60s?
Yeah.
No.
Well, yeah, by this time we were up in another little Jewish community on 47th Street. I found a studio there, which was down the road from Andy's first factory before he moved downtown. And,
what they call Hell's Kitchen now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think I was sort of living in Hell's bedroom. I started playing the synthesizer, and there was a very interesting guy named Gino Pizzerchio who came, Ford model, raconteur, fantastic musician, graduate of Manus, who also became very smitten with the synthesizer. And I also discovered my second band, which was Lothar and the Hand People.
Oh, I remember them.
Right. And they were being A&R'd by John Hammond, who I had a tremendous amount of respect for.
Oh, didn't everyone?
Yeah,
absolutely.
He was an absolutely fantastic guy.
Yes.
So I started playing the synthesizer and rapidly running out of money because we were now in the third year or so of trying to finish Chow Manhattan in some kind of a unstructured way where we would film sequences and then sort of fill in the blanks, and it was never ending.
Uh-huh.
And I finally ran out of money, and I had to close the studio. But the only thing that I left the studio was with my synthesizer. It was the only thing that was really important to me. I'd really found my voice, finally, because I knew I'd never be a great singer or a great cellist. I would never be Yo-Yo Ma, you know. And if I was going to do something, I really wanted to do it full on. Not that I was really interested in standing on the front of the stage in front of an audience. I was very happy behind the scenes.
But you wanted a creative outlet, basically.
Yeah, I wanted
a voice.
Yeah. What really turned into was getting artists to perform to the limits of their potential, utilizing the technology and my political sensibilities and my creativity to get artists to perform to the limits of their potential. And that's exactly what happened with Stevie Wonder.
I definitely want to ask you about Stevie, but I want to connect a few dots on the way there, because of course there's you teaming up with Malcolm Cecil, and
Yes.
that, I mean, I just knowing the two of you, there's a certain yin yang in that kind of personality mix right there that I find fascinating. You know, I mean, you have this
Malcolm and I, we should have never gone our separate ways, and I was somewhat responsible for part of that. But Malcolm always wanted to perform live. I had a couple experiences with the Tonto, the original neo-timbral orchestra that Malcolm and I built, with the aim of going live. But I had two experiences with Malcolm going live, and at the end of the day, I decided I really belonged in the studio and not on stage.
Just didn't like the spontaneity?
You know, it was sort of, the instrument was sort of out of control at the beginning of, you know.
I could see that.
It had a mind of its own. Let's say that. But Malcolm and I really were, for the 5 years we were together, nothing could stand in our way. We were, between the two of us, we had the bases covered. And Malcolm, of course, I met at Media Sound, where I ended up being the studio's synthesist and studio bad boy. And all the engineers there were, at that point, were very sort of establishment white shirt guys with pencil protectors, you know, and very sort of staid, sort of laboratory kind of guys, right?
And you were the artsy hippie kind of dude.
We were completely incorrigible. But I met Malcolm. I walked into the control room one night where I had my synthesizer, and the console in Studio A was homemade. Most of that stuff was homemade.
Sure,
at that time.
Yeah.
And it had a big top plate, and it was open. And I was looking into it. It was just a tangle of wires. It was constantly growing because the tracks were going from 4-track to 8-track to 12-track to 16-track to 24-track. So the whole thing was a huge kludge inside. And Malcolm was standing with his back to me with this huge shock of hair, of black hair, and then rail thin with a tool belt on his, and coveralls with a bib overalls, you know, very tight, and then with a tool belt. And I said, "Do you really know how to run that thing?" And he said, "Yeah, I have to, because I'm here to fix it." Malcolm was hired as the chief of maintenance engineering, and in general, the engineering, not the music part particularly, but like making sure everything ran and designing equipment and switches and new boxes and direct boxes and all kinds of things. And he pointed me, and my hair was like down to my elbows, and I had a gold embroidered vest on when I met him, and like a linen shirt underneath, sort of medieval looking. And I was wearing a huge fur coat because it was winter. And I came in, and he says, "Do you know how to run that thing?" And he pointed to my synthesizer, and I said, I own it." And one thing led to another, and we started working together. And I played him one of my first compositions that I did before I had crossed the threshold at Media. It was called Aurora, and it was about 27 minutes long. And I said to Malcolm, you know, Malky, I'm not even sure this is music. And he said, oh, it's music, all right. And in his clipped British accent, he says, this just needs a little editing. So I said, okay, that sounds reasonable. Well, it ended up being 7 minutes long.
That's a little editing. Yeah.
We lost about 20 minutes, you know.
Yeah.
But we really struck it up. I loved his sense of humor. And the other thing that Malcolm came to the table with was he was an incredible musician. He played with the London BBC Radio Orchestra as principal bassist. And then, of course, he had his residency at the Ronnie Scott's Club in London. And that was the sort of the house band that played behind people who would come from the States or from somewhere in England to play in solo at the club, and they needed a backup band. Charlie Watts was in that band.
Oh, I love
it.
A
lot of very major people in rock played in that band. So Malcolm really knew a lot of the English players. Jeff Beck, who he ended up working with, which turned into an interesting adventure with Jeff and Stevie.
I'll bet.
Yeah, so we started working together at night, and the people at media were very very interested in what we were doing, number one. And number two, the guys who funded Media Sound, they funded Woodstock. So we had a little kind of sort of empathy with them, and they kind of, as long as the job got done, we were allowed to sort of run our course, and we started developing a really good clientele at night after the union dates.
Well, that was sort of how it was back then anyway, right? I mean, it was kind of the Wild West because nobody really knew what they were doing. So,
well, it was feeling as we went. But I brought Richie Havens to the table, who I was working with at Broadway before I got to media. And we worked for about, I guess, a little more than a year, and we slowly started evolving the instrument. There was this crazy Filipino, Spanish, Chinese restaurant across the street. It was a hole in the wall, and they served Chinese food, and they had paper tablecloths in the place. And also the food was loaded with monosodium glutamate. So I used to get very flushed. But we'd go over there and draw out our plans on the tablecloth. And that's how Tonto, the original neo-timbral orchestra, came to be, was from the drawings on the tablecloths, which we then take with us after dinner.
So the idea behind Tonto was basically to just create sort of an amalgam of all these different synthesizers.
Well, yes, and some new thinking as well. Especially important was the ability to control modules from all the different manufacturers who all had different requires.
Yeah.
You know, Moog had switch triggers, ARP didn't have switch triggers. ARP ran on 5 volts, Moog ran on 6 volts. You know, it was like, you know, it was, now we have,
now we have MIDI,
Eurorack. Now we have a Eurorack, and everybody's built, we're finally getting to a place where we don't need keyboards anymore to make music, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is wonderful. But Tonto, keyboards were only one input, right? And we ended up making music for about a year in the studio. We were doing some pretty wacky stuff. And the studio was in an old church. Media was in there's an apartment building on the outside, but on the inside was like a 2-story or more high, looked like a church in England or something, with a peak roof, with big wooden beams and very sort of Baroque interior, stained glass windows. And I had the synthesizer.
Great acoustics, right?
Acoustics were incredible.
I'll bet, yeah.
You know, business loved it for string dates because it was just beautiful for that. And we worked at night with the snow and the rain and all that stuff, and we spent a little more than a year. And one night we were working in the studio around 8:30 or 9 o'clock, and Herbie Mann walked into the studio, who was a flautist, and it turns out had a vanity label on Atlantic called Embryo. And he looked at Malcolm and he says, well, what are you doing here? Malcolm said, oh, we're working on the synthesizer, and it's very interesting. And he said, you, this upright bass player, acoustic bass player, and you're doing this? And Malcolm says, don't knock it till you hear it. And he then left the studio and went downstairs to Studio B to work with one of his acts. And Malcolm said, when you're done, come upstairs. And he came upstairs, and we put up Aurora, and I dragged the synthesizer into this beautiful space in that studio with big ear-level monitors and with a spotlight on it and everything. And we played back Aurora for him, and he said, you want a record deal? And we said, yeah, we do want a record deal. I mean, it was like being inside a spaceship. I mean, the music it's on the recording itself now in the first cut. Mm-hmm. But it was extremely spatial and really sci-fi and very, very full and loud, right? Mm-hmm. And he signed us to a record deal.
So this was Tonto's expanding hit band?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That was the first glimmer.
Uh-huh.
Stevie came and heard that record, and he said, I want to know what this is about. Uh-huh. And a Memorial Day weekend, when no one was around and the studio was closed, we got a call from the street from a guy named Ronnie Blanco, who is a friend of Malcolm's, who played bass. And we stuck our heads out the window. Malcolm had an apartment next door to the front door of the studio, one flight up over the delicatessen, which was next door. And it was, it was already warm. And all the windows were open in his apartment. And we hear, Malcolm, Malcolm. And we stick our head out the window and look down at the front door of the studio. Studio put Malcolm there to be the gatekeeper, basically. Mm-hmm. And if something went wrong, analog equipment, everything went wrong immediately.
Always. Yeah.
Okay. The minute you turn it on, it starts failing, right? Yep. And there was Ronnie standing there with Stevie. We didn't know who he was.
Of course.
And Ronnie said, Stevie wants to see the synthesizer. And the rest is history. We never left the studio for 3 days. Studio was closed. I think we cut 16 or 17 songs that first weekend. And the rest is history, of course.
So did you have any, I mean, obviously you knew who Stevie Wonder was at that point, but he was a completely different type of artist.
But he certainly didn't have the velocity or the star power. This was before the record called Music of My Mind, which was the first record. It didn't do super well, but it sort of set the standard.
Did you have any idea what you were creating at that point? I mean, did you have any sort of a sense of how...
No. With Synthesist, it's sort of, it's not a sound until it falls out of the loudspeaker. Uh-huh. There's no instrument, really. It's any instrument. Mm-hmm. It's all instruments.
Right? Or no instrument, yeah.
Yeah, mm-hmm. It's not it's hard to define it, but the loudspeaker is the final output of the sound. It is not like a clarinet or a horn or a piano or an acoustic instrument.
Right.
So you can't really, I don't know, you can control it in numerous ways. It was highly unstable, and we were still figuring out how to get all the various parts of it to play together and to stay in tune, and it was always, right on the edge. That's part of the reason I call my book Standing on the Edge. Uh-huh. Because if you didn't get the sound right at the moment, right, it would go away and it would never come back. It wasn't digital in the sense that you could repeat each sound and say, oh, here's this sound, E6-3,
right,
blah, 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 right?
Right.
If you didn't get it when you got it,
it was gone.
It's over,
yeah.
Right? And you'd end up saying, oh, I just should have twisted this knob a little bit. Let me just give it a little tiny bit more. And the sound would go away, never to return. So once we got a sound, there was a certain kind of urgency for it. But we really, me, Malcolm, and Stevie, there was no one else around. It was before he had, the mugwumps and all the people coming, the groupies and the people from the record companies hovering around. Stevie didn't have a deal. It was just him. He'd come with one of his girlfriends or a couple of his friends, people, his guide and stuff. Mm-hmm. He found his way around the studio very easily, and once he memorized everything, I would give him a sort of a picture, and I'd walk him around in the studio, or Malcolm, this is where the men's room is, this is, and we would sort of like give him a roadmap. And then we never really even thought of him being unsighted. I mean, he moved around the studio with complete freedom. And what we did is we set up all the instruments in a big circle down in Studio B at Media to start with, and then at Electric Lady. That included the synthesizer, the drums, the clavinet, the Rhodes, whatever we thought he could play, and they were all hot at all times. So Steve could walk from one instrument to the next and do what he felt. We also always kept a live mic in the studio and in the control rooms. We could always hear what we were talking about. We sort of did away with the window between the studio and the control room. In the early days of making music, it was really two separate worlds.
Sure.
One world was the engineers sitting at the console, and the other world was the musicians. But with us, it was a fusion of both the control room and the studio. We became insanely productive for a period of 5 years. No one could touch us.
Is it fair to say that, because Stevie came to you with a lot of ideas, obviously, in his head, I mean, clearly, based on the output that you guys had, is it fair to say that he sort of was almost a guinea pig in a way of giving you a structured project to use this, to learn this equipment with, and to formulate your own?
I don't think you could call it a structured product. I think it would be more like a free-for-all. We'd make a sound. Hey, what about this sound, Steve? Oh, okay. And then you doodle around with it. We make one sound on one keyboard and another sound on another, both mono. And if you listen to those records, you'll see that they're really very simple.
They're very spare.
Yeah, very
there's
spare.
not a lot going on, but there's a lot of
There's
syncopation.
no waterfalls, no
Yeah.
fancy orchestrations, any of that stuff. Everything is kind of built on a jazz and R&B basis, not on the basis of like a Streisand record would be.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
A big
Not
orchestra.
orchestrated in
yeah,
that
or
sense.
Elton or something like that.
Yeah.
But a lot of orchestration, a lot of George Martin stuff. But even George Martin's records were basically very simple. But he used orchestration. Steve wasn't cotton to that. We made a sound that was one voice. It was a mono sound. You know, we used keyboards. The only real multi-timbral instruments were the keyboards, the Rhodes or the clavinet or the acoustic piano. The drums, if you listen to all those records, you'll see the hi-hat is on the left. Why is that? Because that's where Stevie how he heard the drums when he was playing them. And I also gave him that mix.
Mirror image, sure. Yeah.
But it also helped him locate the drums, because we would give him the stereo mix in his headphones, which would mirror the way it was as he sat at the drums. So hi-hat was on the left. So, but it also gave him a good idea sonically of where to put the sticks. I mean, it was subtle. But it really did the job. And we always recorded from the point of view of the player. Even if you listen to keyboard, piano, if we were in stereo, the left hand would be on the left.
Yeah.
You know, it would be down, lower notes. So we always tried to give him a very good sonic picture of what was going on in the room. So it was a fusion of live instruments and electronica. And you sometimes didn't know where one ended and the other began.
So as these musical ideas started becoming reality, so to speak, do you have any idea what you were creating? Were you blindsided by how well these records did?
You know, I'll tell you something. I wasn't blindsided by it. And I wasn't impressed by the fame either. There's only one place I wanted to live, and that has never changed in my life. I don't care about the billboard. I don't really give a flying you-know-what to all the people hovering around and the fame and fortune people and the magazine articles and all that stuff. To me, a song is like architecture, and where I habitually lived was inside the song. I was more interested in what did the bass sound like? Where's the hi-hat coming from? What instrument is opposing this instrument or that instrument? What is the orchestration like? How are we perceiving the sound, and how are we spreading the message? How are we doing that? And what can we do to get, in this case of Stevie, to perform to the limits of his potential and not interfere with his creativity, but to enhance it and encourage him?
So
And that
basically,
we
these
lit-
records would have been a success to you whether or not they did anything, because musically
Yes,
they were
it did.
successful.
I really did. I was naive to it.
Uh-huh.
I didn't. I was more interested in what was going on in the East Village and Max's Kansas City and the scene at night and stuff and like that. But did I have any prescient idea of how good those records were going to be? No. It wasn't part of the program. What was part of the program is very simple. Serve the song.
Uh-huh.
Use the synthesizer as a voice. It was my voice. It was Malcolm's voice. Okay? Those were the voices that were interesting to me. Did I ever go out and party with Stevie? No. Was I ever invited to Stevie's house for dinner or family or any of that stuff? No. My reality began and ended in the studio.
It was a musical
When
collaboration.
Stevie walked in the door, time stopped. And we'd start usually around 7 o'clock at night, and we'd come up blinking in the sunlight out of Electric Lady on the 7th Avenue, blinking in the smog and the sun coming up over Columbus Circle. Okay, and there always used to be this cab driver, this big fat lady. She'd curse like a sailor, and she knew who we were, and she'd take us uptown to our places, our apartments. But it was really built around working with Tonto, which we finally called it Tonto afterwards. I came up with the name on an acid trip a few years before.
Why am I not surprised?
No, you're not surprised. And
So
we've had to figure out an acronym to fit the word Tonto, so Malcolm came up with it actually, or maybe his wife Polly, I'm not sure. Tonto's Expanding Headband, the original neo-timbral orchestra. And it stuck, and that record came out. It made a really big noise, and I was completely shocked by it, but not impressed by it.
So-
I was more interested in figuring out what the next song was going to be.
So the trajectory with Stevie, though, I mean, it definitely changed your trajectory in terms of your work, obviously, because at that point, all of a sudden you're on the map, so to speak. Did that, I mean, obviously it must have impacted you in terms of your professional output.
The only thing that impacted me is what's the next song. Okay, I didn't care about the business part of it. And I think that in the end, because we didn't properly take care of business with Steve in the beginning, it became more and more of an issue, especially down toward the end of the thing. But that's not new news or old news in the music business. It's happened before. It'll happen again. But we really didn't take care of business properly. And that in the end started to really interfere with the process. And also we had moved by this time to LA, and Motown had moved here, and they were backing around and poking around and everything and really interfering with our creative process and stuff. And it was an interesting time with human rights and the Black experience, and here are two white little Jewish boys behind Stevie. There was a certain energy about that. But in the end, Steve and I are to this day friends. I care very much about what he's doing, and I love him, despite our somewhat business agreements which took place outside the studio. But in the end, we did something really marvelous.
Yes, you did.
And to that end, I'm forever thankful for that, to have a voice in terms of not only making some really interesting music and changing the course of electronica and electronic music, but also in terms of human rights and the experience about the Black experience. Living for the City, for example, is, a really major
Life-changing
commentary about that experience. But when I was 21, Stevie was 11 years old. Okay?
Yeah.
So when I was in high school in 1956 and 57, it was John Lewis, it was Martin Luther King, it was segregation in the South and little black girls being escorted to school by white marshals with guns, and some very heavy things, the Norman Pettus Bridge, the assassinations of Martin Luther King, all of that stuff was going on. So when Stevie was 21, I was 31. All right. I'd already been into the civil rights thing in my high school because it was a major in Stockbridge. Part of the curriculum was about civil rights and about, we used to fly the United Nations flag, and in the school hallway there was written on the wall in raised letters, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So by the time Stevie walked in the door, I had already been fully conditioned and primed about civil rights. I had already
your bona fides,
had these, I already had the bona fides. I didn't put it in Steve's face, but when he started doing stuff like Living for the City, I knew that I'd found the right.
Yes, I see.
Yeah, and Malcolm and I did everything in our power. Really, Malcolm was also extremely liberal, and he grew up in the jazz scene, with black artists in London. Okay,
Yeah, of course.
So that's
Tells you everything. Yeah.
yeah. So we came to a place that we were completely liberal, and open, but we would do everything we could to encourage Steve to write things like, he's Mr. Know-It-All, for example, right?
Yeah.
What was that about? Richard Nixon. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of stuff there, but that was at a time when, black kids were migrating to Detroit to work in the car factories and get out of Georgia and all of those places down there that were highly segregated despite the law. Or some of them came to New York and they met a different kind of discrimination. And really, Living for the City is about that.
Yeah.
So it gave me a tremendous feeling of being able to do something that we thought was correct.
Not just from a musical perspective, but from a
but
political.
a social perspective.
Yes.
And most of the successful work that I've done, whether it be with Stevie or with Devo, even Oingo Boingo, okay, was because of the social aspect of it, okay? I mean, freedom of choice. I've just been begging. I just did the liner notes for the
and then so much of Danny Elfman's stuff, same thing.
Yeah. It Danny wrote some really major stuff.
No kidding.
That really didn't get noticed in the early days. I produced one Oingo Boingo album, which was their last album on A&M, and it didn't get the promotion it really deserved because A&M didn't see there wasn't a future album coming up, or so. Yeah. But freedom of choice, I've been agitating the boys for us to re-record it and remix it, which we can't because we can't find the multi-tracks. But freedom of choice now, with the whole business with Roe v. Wade and all of that other stuff going on, I think that freedom of choice would be
a great anthem.
Yeah, would be a great anthem for this election cycle. I'm trying very hard to see about re-recording it with them, but they're busy touring and stuff. But Mark Mothersbaugh and Jerry are just really wonderfully cool and artistic and creative.
Very talented people, yes.
But, they worshipped R&B when I first started working with them. So they knew who I was, and I brought the synthesizer to Devo in that way.
So let me ask you about that, because you made this sort of transition. And I know that working with Stevie per se was not the transitionary thing for you, but it obviously opened up a lot of avenues for you in terms of working with artists that you might not have worked with prior to that.
Like Billy Preston.
Exactly, like Billy Preston. You mentioned R&B, for example, and I know you were big and you worked with the Isley Brothers. But again, was that something, did the fact that you worked on this massive project with Stevie, did it hone your chops in a certain way to get you to the point where you had more of a command over the
Yes.
validity of
Yes.
synthesis in general being so, unpredictable, shall we say?
Yeah, well, it was unpredictable. It was predictably unpredictable. Okay.
Yeah.
And it was always, being an explorer, basically, the pith helmet and the,
Yeah.
with the bullwhip on your side and the, Indiana Jones style thing. But for me, I was inside of that stuff 100%. I didn't care about going out on dates. I didn't care about clubbing or going dancing or dining or tennis or golf. The only thing I want to do, and
make
to this
sounds.
day, okay, was to be in the studio with a great artist making music. And somewhere along the line, technology drives the art. And I think the synthesizer drove the art of R&B in through the 70s and into the 80s, where it was a new voice and gave us a new palette and a new voice. And it gave me my voice, because I certainly wasn't going to be an opera singer or a concert pianist or a cellist. But I didn't know where my voice was until I discovered the synthesizer, and the synthesizer gave me my voice. And for that, I'm thankful to my higher power. I really mean it. There's nothing rational about it. There's not, you consider the universe, it's endless and huge, and there's no being coming to save us from ourselves.
No.
Okay? There really isn't.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we're going to save ourselves, we have to save ourselves. We have to do it. Nobody else has to do it. And that was the kind of attitude I had in the studio. I knew that there was no manual I could look up to get some information. There was no school. There was no anything. I either did it or it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Sometimes we failed miserably. Sometimes we'd be at the synthesizer for 8 hours and not come up with anything that worked. And sometimes it just worked. I could walk up to the instrument and Steve says, I need this kind of really round bass sound. I said, okay. Yeah, Superstition. The first time Stevie played it, he walked into the studio, right? There was nothing on tape. He sat down behind the drums. He said, turn on the recorder. We turned on the recorder. He played for 3.5 or 4 minutes, and we didn't know what the song was. And he came in and said, okay, let's put bass part down. I said, well, what's the song? He said, I just did the drum part. Now we'll do everything else. It's all upstairs.
That fascinates me, because there are only really a handful of artists that can do that can really envision the entire picture in their heads.
It's all in Stevie's brain.
Amazing, isn't it?
It's all in Stevie's brain. He has an incredible memory. I was talking to him about the night we started recording. This is like a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago, when the night we started recording Living for the City. And the first thing he said to me, it was raining. Okay.
Wow.
He has a memory. I marvel at it. He's not like any other person on the planet. He's not perfect. Okay. But the one thing he has is tremendous insight and tremendous power. And through his music. I'm just glad I was around for it. I always like to say me, Malcolm, and Steve were like 3 meteors. You look up in the sky and they're all flying toward one another like this. And then they all collide and there's this big flash of light, and then it goes away.
Yeah.
And that really was basically how I saw it.
Those 3 albums, basically, right?
4, actually.
4, actually? Okay.
Yeah. And there are plenty of songs still in the can. And Steve has been working on this last album for a long time. I helped program 1 song on it. And Steve really gave Malcolm and me really good credits when he played songs from all of those 4 albums at his concert down there we're downtown in the convention center. And he acknowledged our contributions to his work, and it's his work, and we were just enablers, you know.
Yes, yes.
And creating the sounds and the colors that sort of really help reflect his attitude, and I think it drove him along too. The other thing is that when we were working with Steve, we put out 2 albums in 18 months.
Which is phenomenal, and amazing albums too. I mean, really no filler.
I'm just glad I was there for it, and that I had the right frame of mind. But between that and the civil rights issues that were brought to bear, I think we've done a service to mankind.
I would say
and
so.
I
yeah.
think we gave Stevie his voice during that time. We helped him. And I'm just glad that I was able to do that. I think that's more important than my career, where I'm going to be next year when I have to put my anchor down at 83 years old. But I'm still here. I'm still making records, as they say.
You still continue to do a lot of other stuff. And what I like, what I relate to on a personal basis is that you continue to challenge yourself, both with the technology and with the creative aspect of it. You know, you started getting into immersive, I know.
Yeah.
You started getting into some film work
That
again.
really, the immersive stuff really started with Stevie.
Did it?
Yeah. My first immersive mix
Uh-huh.
was a quad mix of Superstition. During the 70s, we had, when we were moving from Crystal, where we had to leave because there's only one studio, and all of the children of Laurel Canyon were using Crystal for the folky kind of stuff. When we went to Crystal, of course, we sucked up all the oxygen. There was no studio time for anybody else but Steve, right? And we had to move. Chris Stone and Gary Kellgren knew that we were looking for a home, and they invited me and Malcolm up to Gary's house on Camino Palmero. It was the old Canadian Embassy. It looked like a haunted mansion, like something out of Charles Adams, right? So we went up there, and Chris and Gary were in the dining room, which was big, sort of, 35 feet long and 15 or 20 feet wide, with this dark
dining room.
You have a huge dining room. We could seat 15 or 20 people in it. Had this huge dining room table in it with a big chandelier over the table. And you could look through from the dining room. You could see through the kitchen and through to the swimming pool in the back. And he sat down there at the table, and he said, "Look, you bring Stevie for a year to the record plant, and we'll build the studio that you want."
Not a bad deal.
And I said, "We have a place for Tonto. We'll have a place for all electronica. And we're going to build a room in quad," because there was a Sansui had developed a concept for putting quad recordings in vinyl.
Yes. In fact, Kent Duncan built the Kendon rooms at the same time and wired them all for quad.
Well,
I remember.
that was after the record plant.
Was it?
Tom Hidley, who developed the Hidley monitors and so forth, a grand acoustician in his own right, was the head of the chief engineer of the record plant around that time. And Chris and Gary said, you bring Steve for a year. And we were doing everything with Steve. I mean, the billing and off, most of the business and stuff. And we thought that was a grand idea. We loved the place. There was a jacuzzi right across the hall from the studio. And we built a quad control room. And strangely enough, it was a confluence of some of the greatest people in the world built that studio. We were working and had befriended John Stork, who built Electric Lady, right? And John Stork was the one who built the cabinets, designed the curved cabinets for Tonto.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So
he mentioned that. I interviewed him last year, and he mentioned working with you to put Tonto together.
Yeah. And he came up, we had to go and measure our arm's reach and everything. It was really designed to accommodate our height and our reach and everything, because we wanted to play facing each other, not facing a wall of machinery.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Makes sense.
So we had the keyboards in the center, and then the synthesizer around the edges, right?
Yeah.
It also worked very well when Steve was playing in the front because we could be programming.
Of course, you could be around him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And we said, well, we want to have John involved as well. So it's the only time in the history of building studios that John Storick and Tom Hidley, Gary Kellgren, me, and Malcolm built that room together.
Wow.
It was...
That's a superpower team right there.
That was a major superpower. Some very clever things going on in that room that you don't really see. For example, the ceiling traps were actually, we built a room over the back hallway behind the studio. There was a hallway and there was a door, but over the hallway, over the top of the hallway, we built a cantilevered room that was a huge bass trap that was totally invisible. Nobody knew it was there.
Oh, I love it.
Right?
Uh-huh.
And the speakers, because of the construction in the room, was very tight, which is very good for listening in quad. And the thing that happened was, of course, the vinyl record part of it was a huge failure.
Right.
Okay, it just didn't happen. But what did happen was Malcolm and I we had a little API console with a quad monitor section. And when we started working with Steve in that studio, we couldn't do anything bad. You could go and take a crap in the corner, it would be a gold record. Okay? It was impossible to do anything bad in that studio musically. The room was so true, and it had Tom's big monitors in it, but they were at ear level. Not up here.
Right.
They were here.
Right.
So I started, Malcolm and I started monitoring when we were recording in quad. And that became invaluable because we could have Steve in the control room and he could hear the background vocals behind him. And we could hear one instrument opposing another instrument. And we could spread things out so that Steve was immersed, as they say today, in the surround. And I've been monitoring like that for 40 or 50 years now, because that was really the true usage of that of that architecture that really gave us the first really immersive audio. And I find it very creative. I don't do it very much now because I'm in my little room here. You know, I don't have I'm not mixing so much. So, but it really, really, really helped us. And now we use immersive. I think Dolby Atmos, for example, is very useful in a big space like an auditorium or a car, which was very much like our little tiny room.
Sure.
Okay, near field. We coined the term near field at Mikasa years later with Dr. Floyd Toole from Harman, right, who came to our studio. We worked out all the sort of standards, helped work out the standards for immersive audio in the home theater environment. But that room was very tight that way and gave Steve a very tactile feeling in there. I don't think they really realized, the people that took over after Malcolm and I went our separate ways, what was going on. They tried to imitate us, but I don't think they really nailed it in the same light. Malcolm, being a great bass player that he was, had, brought a musical level to it. I was basically involved mostly in the programming and the sounds. Malcolm, I mean, he could say, this should go to A minor here and B major over there and blah, 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 right? So we had the bases covered with Steve. And as long as the three of us were in the studio and left alone, magic happened. The minute a lot of people started showing up toward the end of our relationship, it was not the same. And there was a lot of people meddling around. Everyone was suddenly, all these major experts were spurting around here and there. So, but what I learned during that time about immersive audio is something that I've used my entire career. How does your brain know where a sound is coming from? It's a very powerful force, and it's very primal. If you have a sound coming from behind you, your brain says threat. And you have a lot of preconditioned signals
Yes.
that are attached to both your ears and your eyes, and they have to be able to lock up. If you put a sound, for example, if someone's singing, we were experimenting with Boys to Men, and we put some vocals, background vocals in the back and a lead vocal here. And when we had this picture up, it was fine musically, but as soon as we put up the picture where the cue was that they were singing here, but they were hearing their voices back there, it was making
weird.
people throw up.
Yeah, that's weird.
Because it would not, your senses wouldn't lock together.
Yeah.
I mean, the sound helps, especially with 360 photography that I know you're into. You have to be able to have some kind of a system whereby you can tell the eyes where to look.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That corresponds with what the brain is sensing. Yes. Yeah.
So we did that. So I moved on from there and did about 4 years of intense mixing for DTS. After Stevie, after Oingo Boingo, after
1-bit recording and stuff like that.
Well, yes, we were competing against Dolby at that time. DTS had a much higher resolution than Dolby at that time. And we were doing mixing for DVD and Blu-ray for home theater. But DTS also thought about having a label, a music label, which my second partner, Brant Biles, and I got together with the folks at DTS. Tom Holman was also doing some very interesting work with immersive audio. I mean, it was Tom Holman's experiment. What was it? What was the initial? THX.
Oh, sure. I remember THX.
Yeah.
Big in cinema.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tom Holman's experiment.
Really? That's what it stands for, huh? I love it.
We used to, yeah, okay. Tom Holman was a genius. I don't know if he's still with us or not. He might be gone, but I'm not sure. A brilliant guy, I might add. But we ended up at DTS and ended up doing a lot of mixing for music only, and I was locating a lot of titles, both classical and pop. And we spent about 4 years at the Enterprise in a new Capricorn console, which was like a waffle iron. It used to get so hot. And it had a lot of flaws. They used to send a guy to sit with us to make sure, if there was a mistake or something wrong in the programming, he'd write it down. But we would mix quad up there, and the monitors were at ear level and close. And we used to get people crying and everything. I used to kid people. I said, "You see that fire extinguisher over in the glass box? Well, we're taking the fire extinguisher out, and I'm putting in a box of tissues because you can break. If you start crying, you just have to break the glass and get the tissues." I mean, we were doing Pavarotti and a lot of major concerts and classical music and stuff. Some of it with image, a lot of it without image. There's a lot of very good quad recordings made by CBS.
Yes.
And also by who was the British label? I'll think of it.
HMV.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a lot of those, because I know I've heard a lot of those, and there's not that much real, I would say, data behind you as much as there is just ambience.
Yeah,
right?
because they're recording a real-time event.
Yes,
Which is
exactly.
different than electronica. In electronica, you have
You can
the
swim it
ability
anywhere you
of
want.
put music
Yeah.
wherever you want to because it doesn't exist in the real world.
Yeah.
But a lot of those classical recordings were orchestra recordings in a
Right.
whole.
And you want
And I-
authenticity.
Yeah, and I listen now even on my hearing aids because I have Bluetooth. When I'm at the gym, I can be listening to the Bach and so on and so forth in immersive.
I love it.
So yeah, because that's where it really belongs. Okay.
Yes, I could see that.
Yeah. So it's been an interesting adventure, but I spent 3 or 4 years doing that. And then that led to a 10-year stretch with my studio called Mikasa,
Yeah.
which was in Bela Lugosi's old home in Outpost Estates. I didn't feel the need to, it wasn't a studio where I needed the 25 mic inputs. Wasn't recording orchestras. What I was doing there is taking music that had music and sound that had been mixed to picture for theatrical release, which was mixed to at that point to a thing called an X curve, which was a sort of a preset curve that was the same no matter which theater you went to, so that the film would sound the same if it was at the Bijou or at the Paramount or, you know, wherever.
Regardless of what the house system was in that particular theater.
It would be a fixed level and a fixed curve. But the X curve didn't really work very well for home theater, which was a full frequency setup. So at DTS, we really were able to refine that. And then we had a super long relationship, a 10-year relationship with New Line Cinema. And we mixed Lord of the Rings and Guillermo del Toro's movies and a whole bunch of really interesting films, which we mixed from complete stem sets into immersive audio, into surround.
So
and
how is
that
this
was
different for
really
you?
way before its time. We're only now getting to that, you know, 20 years or 25 years later. But I was mixing stuff like that at Mikasa. We had 3 studios. We were doing fantastic business.
So how was this different for you in terms of coming from a musical background? I mean, yes, you had your work in film as well, but to then mixing cinema in immersive, that's another whole set of skills, isn't it?
It is and it isn't. I mean, music's music. And the things moving around in motion and stuff and how...
But you're relating it to picture. That's what I think is different.
But if it has picture, there's a certain amount of linear descriptive stuff. Like if you see an airplane go like this, you know, the sound needs to move. The effects are the most things in motion. The Dolby Atmos or Oro 3D or DTS or any of those. Oro 3D is also quite nice. It's channel based. It's a very nice sounding system, but
as opposed to object
and
based.
simpler. But I think that we are now only just beginning to really start to explore, you know, music in 360, where, you know, I think that where sound comes from is as powerful as any thing like pitch and duration or anything else. But where sound is coming from, the only reason that we didn't have it before is we just couldn't store it electrically. Right? Now we can. And I think now songwriters, if they don't really get too AI'd out, are going to start to consider directionality in terms of their songwriting. And that's, I think, where we're really going to start to see some very interesting work happen. I think we're going to start to, when the kid 17 or 18 years old can sit with his laptop in the kitchen, you know, just before dinner, and he's writing stuff, he's going to start writing stuff and say, oh, that sound has to come from over here. It's going to be opposite this sound that's over here. You know, and they're going to be talking to each other. You know, and that's going to become a part of the palette of writing. We just couldn't do it properly, or it took too much. When you start thinking of trying to convert a stereo analog console to mix immersive audio, you realize that you better call up the Pro Tools guys, okay? Because it's impossible. It's just the wiring and the plumbing is just, you know, it's out of control.
The infrastructure doesn't exist.
It's a challenge. So, but we pioneered that stuff for more than 10 years, and that really was one of the high points of it. The studios were beautiful.
So now you brought this around to a really good place for me to ask you the question that I usually kind of try to paraphrase for concluding these interviews, which is, especially for someone like you who has come up through not just so many musical eras, but so many technological eras where, as you say, the technology really drove the art to a certain extent. And at the same time, exactly. And you still have maintained a consciousness, and not only a consciousness, but a fascination with all this technology. So with that in mind, what would you say to 15-year-old you coming up in this day and age? What advice would you give your young self?
Start playing. don't worry about the instruments so much, but touch your soul and your inventiveness and your magic, because that's where good music comes from. Am I going to recognize pop music in 10 years? I don't think so. I don't know whether I really relate to it. I just finished a beautiful record with Gary Myrick, and it's solid blues from the 30s and 40s. Guitar, bass, and drums, and it's energized and has motion. There's no click tracks. It's all done with the natural sense of rubato and feel, and it's beautiful in a very crude and kind of wonderfully granular way. And I think that there's always going to be people that are going to make music and play. It's not only what's going on in your head, but it's also athletic. You know, music, you have to be connected somehow to the instrument. Now, with AI, which is always a subject that I'm kind of fascinated with, I have to say, is AI, when it comes to music, I'm not talking about science now, because AI and science is doing some very
Different
interesting
animal.
things.
Yeah.
Okay. But for music and art, is it just a big plagiarism machine, looking backwards, imitating, taking everybody's ideas and mixing them together in some kind of strange way and plagiarizing everybody's work? Or is it a new paintbrush?
That's the question.
You know,
if you think about it, I mean, every artist, in a sense, plagiarizes, because what do?
because
We
take subjectivity,
Right.
we
And we
relate
filter
from
it.
our experience, our life
Exactly.
experiences. right?
Exactly.
What's going on? Is somebody writing about what's going on in Israel? Writing songs about that, about estrangement, about fear, about inhumanity?
Human
right?
emotion.
Yeah.
It's the basis of most songwriting, right?
Yeah. But there is no human emotion in AI. Okay? That's what's missing. I've been listening to a lot of it, and I'm fooling around with Sora and a few of these other things.
Yeah.
And my house partner here and fellow co-conspirator in terms of mixing and stuff is very into AI and really brings another sort of understanding of it. But is it just, random, or is there some kind of a deep sort of communication that sort of relates in some way to some kind of feeling or something? Because we're assembling experiences, whether an artist writes it down and writes the Eroica, Beethoven or Bach or Brahms. Are they taking experiences of, great battles in war, 1812 overture that talks about, or is it really just drivel,
Depends whose hands it's in, I guess,
Yeah,
right?
it depends on who's talking to it.
Yeah.
But somehow to me, it lacks the athleticism of this. So I'm not sure. Is it the paintbrush, or is it just the big, machine that plagiarizes other people mindlessly in a strange way? I don't see it soulful right now. It sounds very convincing, but when I'm finished listening to 3.5 minutes of it, I can take it or leave it. I don't care if it's in this style or that style. It still has this kind of, it's not true synthesis either. Okay, where we shape a waveform and then we exercise it in some way.
Yeah.
Okay, there is a difference, and I think that's a major thing to consider.
Time's going to tell where it goes, right?
Yeah, I only hope I last another 10 years because I really want to see what happens.
I know. That's the biggest thing right there is, I understand that we all have our lifespan and everything, but I feel like, whenever we check out, it's like, wow, 10 years later, it could be something really cool.
I'll say this. With what's going on in the world today, I don't have any expectation when you consider the vastness of the universe, all right, the unending light years of the universe. There's no one coming to save us, okay? What we think is going to save us is created by man. It has nothing to do with the real reality.
Of course.
If we're going to save ourselves, we have to do it ourselves. No one's coming from outer space to make things better. There's no big daddy in the sky
There's no big
to
man
say
in the
it's
clouds.
all right,
Yep.
pat you on the back and give you a hug and say it's going to be okay.
Yep.
That's not going to happen, okay?
Yep.
If we don't do it for ourselves, no one's going to do it for us. And I am just shocked and mortified at what I see around me, the ultimate violence of it all, and how we spend our treasure building bombs and bullets and killing people. And we glorify it, and fighter pilots are these wonderful men who go out and fight the world and jockey these fancy pants fighter planes and all that stuff. If we would spend our treasure on what really counts, about like feeding people and giving people health care and looking
Homes and,
after and homes and food and nourishment and things that are enlightened and positive, how much more we could do on this world if we stopped living the life of just the gun factory. You know, President Eisenhower, I remember as a little boy, always said, beware of the military-industrial complex. And I don't know how a musician or a creative like myself can answer that. I think the only thing that comes close to it for me, it really touched me, was Living for the City. Okay? Where we talk about the injustice in a way that people can understand it, and understand that humanity has to have a better place, and that the violence has to come to an end.
And 50 years later, that song is still just as relevant.
I'm just absolutely mortified as a Jew of what's going on in Israel.
Yeah.
And their Jews' inhumanity to the Palestinians. I find that the Palestinians,
disturbing.
those guys didn't do the right thing, you know, the whole thing with the music festival. But to kill 35,000 innocents is not the answer, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that music and art has to talk about it just as much as Picasso spoke about Guernica, about the Spanish Civil War. I mean, we have to talk about it, and we have to bring justice to those things. And I think part of what art's story is to help bring justice.
Absolutely.
And I think, you know, that's what Stevie brought. And now I hear he's going to move to Ghana. And I don't blame him. I really don't. He's fought the fight. He stood up. He was the one who was responsible for the Martin Luther King holiday.
Yeah.
You know, but he stood up for what he could. And I can't expect him at his age to be yet another revolutionary with his hair on fire. It's just not going to... We need new heroes.
We do. We need new heroes, and we need new anthems as well. And that's part of what I hope we will see.
Yeah, well, I'm all for it, you know.
Yeah. Amen.
Anyway, with that amen, it's 10 after 4. Do you think we've done enough?
I think we have. Bob Margouleff, thank you for being my guest.
I'm delighted, really, and thank you, too, for helping me find a place for my beautiful book. It's called Standing on the Edge, and it's about my life and loves and my adventures in music and art over the last 60 years.
I look forward to reading it.
Thank you. Thanks for making this happen.
Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.